Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. After about 5 years in Ohio Penitentiary, where he was serving a term for manslaughter, Don King was released. He had been a bookmaker, and he was accused and convicted of killing a guy on the street over a gambling argument. And he decided he wasn't going to go back to jail. As a bookmaker, he made pretty good money, but now he set out in his own mind that he was going to make up for lost time and try to make some big money. And he was back in Cleveland, operating on the streets as a bookmaker. And at the same time in Cleveland was another Don, a guy named Don Elbaum, who was a boxing promoter. And Don Elbaum, like Don King, was a character. Apparently, Cleveland breeds these characters. Don Elbaum was a little short guy with a very, very flat nose because all the cartilage, he was a former fighter, and they took all the cartilage out of his nose. But he had very bright eyes, and he was a nice-looking man with a nice smile and a nice demeanor. He was a little guy, but he was a terrible dresser. He was the worst dresser I think I've ever seen in my life. Don Elbaum would wear striped pants with a plaid jacket and a loud shirt and a ridiculous tie, and none of it matched, and he didn't care. It didn't matter. He was, in crazy shoes, none of the colors. It was a color clash on 2 feet, and he would go along and wear that. Not only that, he was a terrible businessman. He was a boxing promoter, and he was on the eve of promoting a big supposed boxing show, which is a charity benefit for a local Cleveland hospital, and with Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay later became Muhammad Ali, but at that time he had just come from the Rome Olympics, where he won on national television the gold medal in the heavyweight title at the Olympics. And he was a handsome, gifted athlete. He won impressively. He had a fabulous personality. He had star quality, and everybody knew him already, even though he was an up-and-coming young kid from the Olympics. And Don Elbaum was there, going to be his promoter. But Don Elbaum was a terrible businessman. Another promoter, Mickey Duff, who was the biggest promoter in Europe, summed it up in his Cockney accent about Don Elbaum in 2 quotes. He said, "Don Elbaum is such a businessman that if he bought a cemetery, people would stop dying." He said, not only that, when Don Elbaum dies, they're going to have to screw him in the ground to bury him. And that pretty much summed it up. But Elbaum never had 2 nickels to rub together. He always needed 95 cents to make $1. So sure enough, Don King heard about this boxing promotion and saw it as an opportunity to make some money. And he came up with the money that Elbaum needed to get the promotion off the ground and became Elbaum's partner. Well, that was Elbaum's doing because Don Elbaum was left behind, left in the dust. By the time King got done with the promotion, he was Cassius Clay's best friend. And he ingratiated himself with Clay, who was a phenomenal talent. And Don King played the race card and every other card he could play. He was unscrupulous. He was, boxing is pure capitalism. There's no rules in boxing. And if there were, they break them all anyway. It doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. And Don King was a real buccaneer. He was like Blackbeard the pirate. All he needed was a ship. And Cassius Clay provided that ship. And Don King made a career. He leveraged his relationship with Cassius Clay. He left Don Elbaum where he was with his floozy girlfriends and his loud clothes. And he went on to become preeminent in boxing, right at the top of boxing. And using the leverage of his relationship with Cassius Clay, who then became Muhammad Ali and world famous, and the rest is kind of history. But Don Elbaum was a total rascal. I mean, Tim Witherspoon was a heavyweight champ from Philadelphia, a very well-spoken young man who said in Time magazine, quote, "The number one category of crime in America is black-on-black crime, and Don King is its primary practitioner." He says the number one practitioner of black-on-black crime is Don King. And Don King was a real rascal of a character. I had quite an experience with him. I had 3 clashes with him, 3 legal battles with him. The first one was on behalf of Wilfred Benitez, who was a 3-time world champion and about to sign a promotional contract with Don King to campaign as a middleweight. The problem is Don King exploited all the fighters, and he used different methods with different people. In Benitez's case, he used Benitez's parents, his mother and his father. The father was a heavy drinker and a degenerate gambler who lost all of Wilfred's money at the racetrack. And the mother enabled the father all the time. And Don King would advance money to Gregorio Benitez, his nickname was Goyo, and Wilfred's father. When he ran out of money, which he invariably ran out of money, he went through $9 million of the kid's money. And he would advance him, let's say he would give him a check for $50,000, and then he would have Wilfred sign an IOU to pay the father's debt out of the next purse that Wilfred had, and let the father off the hook. Meanwhile, because he was the resident moneylender for the mother and father, he would get them to pressure Wilfred to sign promotional contracts at a steep discount from their market value. They were far less than what he could really get on the open market. And that's how Don King exploited that kid. He did other things with other kids too. As a result of that, I got a case from a promoter. Don King was trying to steal this fighter from another promoter in Detroit. And it was on behalf of a rising welterweight fighter, Tyrone Trice, a very gifted young fighter, a terrific kid. And I started a lawsuit with King, and I knew the law, and he couldn't get away with it. And I had him trapped, and he realized it, and he settled the case. That got me another case for another Detroit fighter held by the same promoter where Don King was trying to steal his promotional contract. A guy named Obakar, a young man named Obakar, another outstanding young fighter. And on that one, King gave up. I didn't even have to start the lawsuit. He says, "Oh, you got this case?" He said, "Listen, you're too much for me." He's giving me the phony flattery. "You're just too much. I give up," he said, because he knew I was going to win the case. He had no standing, and he knew that I knew he had no standing to win this case. He said, "Just be reasonable, and we'll make a settlement." And we did, and it was no problem, and that went away. That didn't mean Don King reformed. He went on exploiting fighters, and one other instance was Hector Camacho, who was a big name, and Camacho was dealing with King and went in one instance to sign a promotional contract for a number of fights and title defenses, and stupid Camacho went there with no representation. He represented himself. He was going to outsmart Don King. Yeah, fat chance. Don King knew the kid was car crazy, and that was his weakness. So he puts out a contract for the kid to sign. And the kid doesn't even know how to read. He can hardly read. And he said, "Oh, this is good." He said, and the kid was a little bit hesitant. He said, "Hector, Hector Macho Camacho." He says, "Hector, what's the best car in the world?" He said, "Oh, Lamborghini Countach." He says, "Oh, Lamborghini Countach? Yeah, what color?" He says, "Yellow is the best color that they have." He goes, "Good. I have one at your house tomorrow morning. Sign the contract." The kid says, "Tomorrow morning?" "Yeah." He said, "We're going to deliver it tomorrow morning." He said, "It'll be at your front door." "Okay, I got your address. I know where you live. You're in Harlem, Spanish Harlem. You're going to have the car. You're going to be the only guy in Spanish Harlem with a Lamborghini Countach, yellow." Kid signs the contract. So that was Don King. But he was a total rascal. And one of his trusted aides told me a story that it's typical Don King. Only he could pull this off. Don King and this aide was in the room with a very, very famous, nationally prominent black minister who was one of the big figures in the civil rights movement nationally, and the minister's wife. And they were upstanding people, church-going people, very dignified, etc., etc. And they came there for a donation. And King is waxing poetic. He gets to start when he goes on his riff. He goes up and he starts yelling and jumping up and down like a Southern Baptist preacher. He's showing the preacher that he could preach. Only thing is, he starts using freely the MF word, MF this and MF that and MF this and MF that, and the wife is squirming every time he says MF. She's squirming. So his aide says to him and notices. He said, "Oh, Don," he says, "excuse me, Reverend, ma'am, Don, we got a call. We got to make that call to overseas," he said, and they're waiting for us, and we're 2 minutes late. Let's get out. Let's go inside and make that call. We'll be back in 5 minutes, folks. So Don knew there was no call, but he also knew not to ignore this guy because this is his right-hand guy, and he knew, he wasn't going to, it must be something that the guy's got to tell me that's important. He goes outside. He goes, "What's up?" He says, "Don," he says, "I don't know if you know." He says, "But every time you MF and this and MF and that poor woman is squirming. She's like, she can't, she's not comfortable. You're making her very uncomfortable." He says, "Now go back in there and straighten this all out." He goes, "I got it. Don't worry." He goes back in. And he says, yeah, well, we made that phone call. Thanks for waiting, folks. He says, now, white people, they steal everything from black people. He says, they steal our culture. They steal our clothing styles. They steal our music. They steal our hairstyles. They steal everything we got. But one thing they could never steal is our word motherfucker. That's our word. He says, and I'm proud of that word, and I say it loud, and you say it loud with me, motherfucker. And they did. They got up and motherfucker. And he goes, amen. And he sits down, and they smiled. The Reverend went out with his donation, and everything was smooth over. And Don goes on and on and on in his career. So now, getting back to the Benitez thing, Benitez signed a contract, and 3 months later, we're in Las Vegas at the Dunes, where he's going to have a first middleweight fight pursuant to that contract. And I'm there at training camp, and I took a break. It gets pretty hectic, and it's 5 o'clock. It's a cloudy day. Nobody's in the swimming pool, and I said, this is a great time. I can go out and get a quick swim for 5 or 10 minutes, just to take a breather. And nobody, the pool is deserted. And out of the other end of the swimming pool comes this giant black man with the hair sticking up, draped in a purple bath towel, a big giant purple bath towel. He walks across the whole pool to where I am at the shallow end of the pool, doesn't say hello, doesn't say anything. First words out of his mouth, he says, Rudy, street guys like us got to watch out for these silver spoon motherfuckers that try to take everything from us. He said, we got to stick together. And he was alluding to Bob Arum, who was a silver spoon guy who went to Harvard Law School. That was his arch rival in the boxing promotion business. And he hated Arum. I didn't like Arum. I'd much rather deal with Don because there were no pretense about him. He was out to take the eyes out of your head and your jewelry, whatever he can get. And you knew it. Bob Arum was not that kind of guy. Bob Arum had a sugar coating to everything, but he was just as bad, if not worse, than Don King. Only he hit it. And Don King, I was successful with him because I had grown up with criminals and bullies and street guys and bookmakers, and I knew his act. And I also knew when I negotiated with him, I had the cards, and he didn't. And I knew what cards I had, and I knew they were winning. I had a winning hand, and he didn't. And we both understood that. He was a bookmaker. He could figure that stuff out just as well, if not better than I could. And that's why I was always successful with him. And anyway, Don King went on, and he and Bob Arum together carved up professional boxing, and they dominated it for decades and decades and decades. They made fortunes, and they made it at the expense of a lot of fighters that they promoted. And all I could say is there's no business like show business. In boxing, is show business with blood, and Don King was an expert showman in show business with blood. He knew how to get what he wants out of the boxing business. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.